and welcome to Education Matters here on Channel 96. Thank you for tuning in today. I appreciate you being with me. As you can tell from the title, I want to talk about movement in physical education as far as education in the classroom, not just, gym class that we know about from when we were in school. Why am I talking about this? Well, we're in summer. It's still summer vacation. But you know what? Fall is coming up fast. And we've had children that have been able to be outside and playing and expending large amounts of energy pretty much every day. We've had some pretty good weather. It's been hot, but heat doesn't seem to bother the little ones too much. So what I'm seeing here is that we have maybe 8, 10, even 12 weeks of children who have been outside, who have been playing, who have been burning off a lot of energy. Now, if you're a parent or a grandparent or you know children, you know that children have enough energy that I'm sure somebody has said at least once, if you could harness it, you could pretty much power every light bulb in the city. Kids have energy. And in just a short amount of time, those very energetic children who have been running and riding bikes and playing games and swimming and hiking and having a really great summer now have to turn around and go into school and sit down and be attentive for hours every single day, 5 days a week. That's a very difficult task to ask of anybody. We as adults still have energy, and we find it difficult to sit down for hours on end and do a wide variety of tasks, okay? We like to be up and around and moving. That's how we sort of keep what is called a level of arousal. And children need to have that level of arousal as well. Because when you're sitting for a long period of time, you can kind of get lethargic. You can just sort of zone out. You can lose your focus. You can lose your attention. And so what do we see? We see children who are trying to kind of get up to a level of arousal where they can attend. The younger the child, the greater the need to get up and move around. 1, to burn off energy, and 2, for a lot of kids, to get to that level of arousal so that they can continue to learn. Now let's take an adult, an average adult. When we're in a situation where we have to learn something, maybe we're in a lecture, maybe we're at church listening to our minister or our priest or our rabbi, maybe we are having some kind of a conversation with a small group of people where people get a chance to talk for fairly long amounts of time. For whatever reason, we're trying very hard to remain attentive. As adults, what do? Well, we may be playing with our earrings if we have earrings, and men wear earrings too. It's not just women. So we might be playing with an earring here. Or, have you ever seen somebody tap their lips with either their finger or a pencil or a pen? There are a lot of nerve endings in the mouth, in the lips. There are nerve endings in the ears. And these activities actually help a person kind of develop a better attention. When they start to feel their attention wander, it's almost like they're stimulating themselves one way or the other. Now, I know some people would play with their hair. A psychologist would say, well, if they're playing with their hair, they probably have an emotional problem. Psychologists always find emotional problems. The reality is that if you're tugging on your hair for one thing or another, or you're playing with your hair, most likely you're trying to stay attentive to what is happening. Somebody talking, an activity going on where you have to observe. You're trying very hard to pay attention and be at a level of arousal so that you are attentive enough so that it kind of goes in and you're processing it in your brain. children are no different, except that they don't have the same techniques we do. They have a different set of techniques. It's usually get up and move around. And those are the kiddos that really struggle in a classroom, because what happens when a child gets up? Sit down in your seat. Why can't you sit down in your seat? How come you're not sitting down in your seat? You have this whole sit down in your seat going on in many classrooms in the country, if not all. And what does that do to the child? Yes, we eventually have to be able to sit in our seats and listen to lectures and do work. But what I'm saying is, for the little kids who have not developed those techniques that we as adults have, it's a lot more challenging. So you have to differentiate between the child who stands up and keeps on writing or doing his work or her work, doing their math, whatever, and the child that has a lot of movement and that just has to move because he or she has so much energy. And so the teacher should be aware that there are two different types of movements. Many times teachers are not. So what's my suggestion? If you're in a parent conference and you're a parent, grandparent, caregiver, and somebody says to you, well, you know, they have to move around a lot, you need to ask the question, are they still paying attention to what they're doing? Or have they lost focus completely, and are they just burning off a lot of extra energy? Now, those are two different types of kids. And depending upon what the answer is, you have a different protocol for treatment. So if the teacher doesn't know, if the teacher just sees the child get up and does not observe whether this child is still doing their work and still paying attention, or if the child is just spinning around his desk or her desk, then the teacher needs to kind of probe a little bit more, because this is really going to be important. How we treat that child depends upon whether the child is still doing work but has gotten to another level of arousal so that he or she can still attend, versus the child that has a lot of energy to burn off. Now, what do we do with those kids that have a lot of energy? Well, I have to say that medication, I am not a real fan of medication. So just calling up a doctor and saying there's an attention problem, my child needs attention issues, addressed, the teacher, the school psychologist, somebody is saying, we have to look at medication. I think that needs to be put on the back burner and really kept back there. Because if you look at what the research says, the research is very clear these days. It does not enhance a child's educational experience to be on medication. So in other words, if the child is, say, hyperactive or just inattentive, and that child is put on medication, that child may appear to be more attentive because the child doesn't get up and move around, because the child may be looking as if he or she is focused on the teacher. But the educational experience, the ability to learn better, does not appear to be happening when a child is medicated. So what most of the research hospitals are saying is, let's look at the placement first, and then we'll examine whether the child needs medication or not. Now, that may be another conversation for another hour or half hour here on Education Matters, but I thought I would throw that out there because we do have two different types of movement in a classroom. For many children who are required to sit down and stay seated for long periods of time, we see them kind of fidgety. They are old enough that they know they have to sit in that chair, but boy, do they fidget. And this is hard for them to sit down and retain enough wherewithal to be attentive. What do they do with that extra attention, that extra energy? Well, I have a few things here And you know, the best friend you have at this point is going to be an occupational therapist, because they are really the masters of finding ways for children to have some kind of a fidgety toy or fidgety implement that will allow them to move their hands to get some kind of a tactile stimulation, but at the same time not get up and run around the desk. So I have several. I have one that's this little prickly unicorn-like critter, and it's some kind of silicone, and it squeezes. Okay, and some children like that little prickly feeling on their hand, and there's a little tummy here you can squeeze, and that may work just nicely for them. I have another one with little bubbles on it. And this also squeezes, and they get a little bit of resistance. It doesn't squeeze all the way, but there's enough of a resistance so that they can keep their hands moving. It's almost like silly putty in that respect. And then, of course, we have those little balls where they get a lot of tactile sensation from these little prickly pieces of rubberized material, and it can be moved back and forth. And the final one I have is usually for older kids because it will pull apart and if you give it too much of a stretch. And so just having it, moving it in the hand, moving it back and forth seems to be a soothing activity. Now, you don't want anything that's going to be too outrageous as far as having a lot of activity, having a lot of focus, a lot of attention, because you want that child to be paying attention to the teacher. So in order to have the child pay attention to the teacher, but still have something in their hands to kind of get them maybe to a level of arousal, maybe to have a bit of a focus so that they can pay attention to the teacher, this sort of a thing might be just the thing. Now, for older students, it may be more difficult. They don't want to be carrying around a little pink and white squishy ball, or, you know, what somebody would say is, oh, it's a little toy. You might not want to do that. But what I have here is a keychain. And on the keychain are these little bubbly, almost like sandpaper. If you think of smooth sandpaper, I know that's sort of a contraindication here, but it's a rough surface, but it's not a sandpaper surface, and it gives the right tactile feedback. So that if a child or a youngster, a high schooler even, college student, is moving their hand back and forth, they're getting enough of a tactile feedback so that it's not as difficult for them and it's not as obvious. My last one, of course, is my own little notebook. And what do I have here? I have the same little surface right up here. I have it inside a notebook. It's got a sticky back to it, and you can stick it pretty much anywhere. And rub your hand on it, and it works out just fine. So it doesn't have to be very, very obvious. But the fact that it's there, and the fact that a child can maneuver, play with it, and when I say play, I'm not saying focused on this. What I'm saying is that they can move their hands and they can get enough of a tactile feedback so that they are able to attend, they have a level of arousal, and they're going to do better in the classroom. And again, your occupational therapist is going to be the one to help you with this. And the occupational therapist should ask the parents and the student, what's happening in the classroom? How hard is it to pay attention? When do you have difficulty? Is it just in one class? Is it in all classes? Is it in reading class? Now, why I say that is because look what I have here. I have a lot of different colors. I have all kinds of colors of paper. I also have green, but green doesn't show up too well on these screens. So I haven't put up my green color. But I have blues and grays and purples and pinks and goldenrods and pretty much any color you can think of. And I have photocopied material on these papers. Why? There's something called scotopic sensitivity syndrome. And it is a difference in the way children and adults see. What happens is that sometimes the words appear to be moving. They shift, they shimmy. Sometimes they crawl like ants. Sometimes they lift off the page or sink into the page. It has to do with the waves of color and how the eye responds to this wave of color. We have black print on white paper. These waves of color can really start to look distorted after a while, maybe 15 or 20 minutes. And for the whole population, we figure probably 5 to 7% at most struggle with this. But what we have seen, especially with children, is that when they try to read, they either get very, very sleepy, or they get very antsy and they have to move and shift and get up and walk around, and they're looking away from the book. They're doing everything but focusing on the page. If the child has this challenge in reading, before we start to talk to pediatricians about medication or anything else, it's going to be really important to evaluate how well this child responds to different colors of paper. And if there is a color that the child responds to and pays attention to and doesn't fall asleep or doesn't feel antsy and has to get up and move around, that's a pretty good indication that you may have a visual difference that needs to be addressed. It's not an expensive issue. Believe me, there are little strips of colored covering, like it's transparent, but it's colored. You can get that. You can get a full page overlay. There's any number of assists that, as I said, are very inexpensive, that work very nicely, that help a child focus, pay attention, and it really makes a difference for them learning to read and continuing the reading process beyond 15 or 20 minutes. If you as an adult fall asleep when you're reading, maybe in 15 or 20 minutes, you might want to investigate this, because it doesn't go away in adulthood. And as I said, 5 to 7% of the population experiences this visual difference. So it's worth looking into. So getting back to a child needing to move, we don't see enough movement in the classroom. Now, there's a wide variety of reasons for this, but the bottom line is children have to move. And if you see a classroom that is set up to have different learning stations, for example, those learning stations are excellent if you have a child that, 1, responds to the learning station setup, 2, is a self-motivated learner, and 3, can have the direct assistance from a teacher. But just going from one station to another without real supervision and help at every station means that those children who are experiencing any type of a learning difference or who are struggling with one subject or another may avoid the learning station, may give it minimal attention, may not really learn in that way. And yes, they would be moving. Yes, they're up and down and around, but that movement doesn't have meaning. So it has to be more of a directed activity. And in the old days, way back when we saw teachers coming out of teacher colleges, we saw teachers having students stand up and breathe, having students walk around the room, having students do a variety of learning activities that are very physical. We also saw a lot more recesses. Somehow or other, the belief that a recess isn't important, especially for little kids, has gotten out there into the education field, and I'm not sure the justification for this. But children do need to have recess. They need to get up. They need to move around. Moreover, if the recess activity takes too much time out of the day, it would be important for the teachers to build in movement in their classes every single day, and not just like, well, we'll do movement at 9:45 and then we're going to have, we can forget it for the rest of the day. No, it's building lesson plans around very specific movement activities where the children have to get out of their chairs and do something. Yes, it's structured. Yes, it's teacher directed, but we're looking at the need for children to move. One, to burn off energy, and two, to get to a level of arousal where they can continue to attend and attend well. We cannot learn if we aren't paying attention. And in all honesty, as adults even, we have to work very hard to pay attention in some instances. It's difficult. It's very difficult. Well, think of a 6, 7, 8-year-old child, even middle school and high school kids, with all of the things going on, with all of the multi-sensory activities that are happening, where you have a lot of television viewing and you have a lot of things going on with the tablets and with the cell phones. There's so much media, there's so much electronics that these kids interact with every day, that to sit down in a classroom that is sort of low tech is a very difficult thing for them. And yet, it's these low-tech situations where they, in fact, will learn, if they are at a level of arousal where they can do so. Which is why we have to build in that movement at every single step of the education process. I cannot emphasize enough the importance, especially for children, coming back into school in the fall after having 8, 9, 10 weeks of what we call freedom, where they're out and running and playing. I cannot emphasize the importance of slowly adjusting back into school and not having school a burden for them. And it sometimes is a burden for kids, not just for the ones that have to run around because they have so much energy, but for those children that really struggle to maintain a focus. They want to do well in school. They work very hard at trying to do well in school. But to have to sit for such a long period of time every single day is very difficult. And so when we have these different physical helpers, where they can move and attend and develop a level of arousal so that they can continue to pay attention to the teacher in a fairly lengthy activity, that makes all the difference in the world. I will tell you that when I work with children, and I work with children from ages 5 all the way through college, and I teach reading. I teach reading every day. It's multisensory. It's Orton Gillingham reading. And I break down my 1-hour lesson by minutes. So I would do something with an alphabet, for example, and I give it no more than 3 minutes. And then I move on to what we use cards. We have sound symbol cards, and that is a 3 to 5 minute activity. When I introduce a new letter or sound symbol or a new concept, I give it no more than 7 minutes. 7 minutes is my cutoff, because after 7 minutes, I've lost that student. They are not able to maintain a level of arousal well enough to be able to continue learning, which means at the end of 7 minutes, boom, I have to move on to a handwriting activity, to a spelling activity, to something else, but I'm not going to stay with the same introduction for a concept or sound symbol, because I know the limitations of students. I know the limitation that everybody has. 7 minutes, maybe 10, will be the maximum that you can hit for that instructional point before you move on to something else. And so because of that, because I go by minutes, I know that I have kept my students at the necessary level of arousal to maximize their reading instruction. What I'm saying is that this level of arousal needs to be maintained in virtually all of the classes throughout the day. This is not an easy thing to do. This is where lesson plans become so demanding, because children are spending so much time in a classroom working very, very hard to pay attention, that if they don't have the opportunity to get to a level of arousal where they can learn, a lot of the instructional time is going to be lost. And we cannot afford it. Not with the high stakes testing, not with the need to spend pretty much all of September reviewing what they learned from last year, not with all of the interruptions that we're seeing in the classroom. And so because we have limited time, because we have, if you take off the 20 days in September for the review and you take it from the 180, you're down to 160. That's really not much time to teach the entire scope of what has to be taught for that school year. So I have to say one of the important things is to maximize that time. And to do that, it means that we as teachers have to spend a lot of time figuring out how many minutes of instruction need to be devoted to new concepts, to new material, and then expect to revisit it every single day until a child hits mastery. Now, hitting mastery is different for every single child. And I will tell you that for some kids, an extra 15 or 20 minutes is all they need to hit mastery. But they may not get that because their learning curve may be different from the learning curve for the rest of the class, and they never get a chance to hit mastery. And that's also another topic for another day. But the bottom line is we have to go by minutes. We have to look at how many minutes a child takes to learn, how many minutes it takes for the child to hit mastery, how many minutes we need to keep that level of arousal so that children will be able to attend. And we have to make sure that while those children have all that energy and need to burn it off, we're keeping them moving. And in those in-between times when we're not having them move all over the classroom and we're not having them out at recess, we need to be able to have them doing something with their hands so that they're able to burn off a little energy, put a little focus somewhere so that they're paying attention to the teacher, but at the same time, they're manipulating an object that gives them sufficient tactile kinesthetic feedback to be able to function in a classroom. I hope this has been helpful. I certainly feel that this is an important topic. I'm glad you tuned in today. I thank you very much for doing it. I'll be with you again next week for some more information, because education in this day and age matters so much for our children. They're our future, and we want them to have the best future possible. The only way we can do that is to make sure that, one, the job of childhood, which is learning to read, is a successful one for all of them. And two, that education does indeed matter, and they are, in fact, lifelong learners. Those are the two important ingredients in helping our children grow and develop to be the best and most productive citizens and happiest kids ever.